How's it going, guys? Welcome back to Crafting Cars. First off, thank you for your patience. I haven't uploaded in like a month and a half, and today you're gonna see why. I recently tackled the largest automotive project that I've ever done, and that is replacing the head gaskets, timing belt, and water pump on my 1994 Acura Legend. The job took me 55 hours to complete, but I really took my time, cleaned everything, was super clean along the way, and I replaced any worn parts that I found as well. Let me show you the tools I used for the job. So here's all the basics I used. It's also nice to have access to air tools as well. But we have a 1/2 inch impact rated socket set with swivels and extensions. Obviously you're gonna want a torque wrench, 1/2 inch breaker bar, gloves to protect your hands, to keep yourself clean. Also Ziploc bags for staying organized. You're gonna want a couple lights. I got this big one for lighting everything up under the hood, but a lot of small ones are nice too for getting in all the nooks and crannies. For cleaning mating surfaces, I use 220 grit emery cloth. I've got a wire brush, nylon brush, couple nice razor blades, and I use this die grinder too with the Scotch-Brite disc on it. For hard carbon, I get rid of it with the carbon choke cleaner. For any baked on grease or grime, I use the Super Clean. And for keeping some of our bolts from seizing up in the future, I use copper anti-seize. I got an M12 impact here just for speeding up assembly and disassembly. I cannot stress this enough. There's so many tight areas in the engine bay. Your hands will probably get a little cut up, but having things like ratcheting wrenches, shallow sockets, and little things like that really make a big difference. Of course, we got our standard socket set with a couple extra swivels and extensions. Now, taking the EGR pipe off the engine is one of the most challenging portions of the job just because it's such a tight space. But if you have a 1/4 inch ratchet with a 10mm socket, as well as a 1/4 inch extension and a 1/4 inch swivel, it really isn't that bad. I like to put a little tape on the swivel just because it kind of stiffens it up, so when you lower it in the engine bay, it's not flopping around. I printed out some documents from the Acura Legend forum. This is a nice source. I'll go ahead and link it in the description, but it's got nice pictures just to keep you organized. You're gonna want a flathead and Phillips head screwdriver, magnet for getting any dropped bolts. I got this like combination 1/2 inch and 3/8 ratchet here with a little bit bigger handle for kind of helping get some more torque on breaking things loose or tighten things up. I use a crescent wrench for getting the knock sensors removed. That's one thing that's really important. You got to get those removed before pulling the heads. Honda Bond RTV. This is really the only RTV you should be using on these Honda engines. Pry bar, of course. Pliers for removing all your hose clamps. Pick tool for kind of cleaning tight spots. I use heavy duty zip ties for kind of zip tying things out of the way to give yourself more space. And then I use this small black zip ties for replacing any plastic clips that I broke on the wire harness. There's only a couple bolts on the head that use Allen screws, but it's nice to have an Allen set as well. I use these carbide scrapers for cleaning up gasket surfaces. These were really helpful on cleaning up the cylinder head mating surfaces. Masking tape and a Sharpie for labeling. I've got this Honda crank pulley adapter tool. This will help break the pulley loose, or in my case, I used it for torquing things down. I had to use a 3/4 inch impact for breaking it loose. Thread tape, I use this for my oil pressure sensor. Got a set of these copper sealing washers for stuff like your fuel line, banjo bolts. I got this 3.5mm vacuum line. This will work to replace any vacuum lines that get damaged during the project. Now you probably don't need this. I just used it because when I removed my hoses off the heater core ports that go into the firewall, I accidentally damaged those little copper pipes. So you can kind of use this. I think it's called a swedge. It goes inside those pipes. You give it a squeeze and it kind of rounds them back out. I ditched the factory Y-pipe little heat shield here, and I made my own out of Inconel stainless steel wire ties and using tin snips here. The reason I did that is it gives you a little bit more room for removing and attaching the Y-pipe, because this kind of takes up a lot of space in the engine bay. Then of course you're going to want some nice funnels. I use this one for filling up my transmission fluid and oil, and I use this one for filling up my coolant and bleeding the coolant system. Now, I'm not a professional auto mechanic. I'm only YouTube certified, and this is my first time pulling apart a complicated V6 engine. But I believe if you're mechanically inclined, you take lots of pictures and label everything, this job is definitely not impossible. So I decided to film all 55 hours of labor in time-lapse mode so I can condense it into a 10-minute video for you guys. Hopefully it helps you out. I'll go ahead and link the sources in the description that helped me out, and I hope you enjoy the video. So to free up some much needed space, we remove the battery, the air intake, I drain the coolant, remove the fuse box, and start disconnecting all the electrical connectors and bringing the harness towards the front of the car. Then I move on to removing the vacuum lines off the top of the engine. And you want to remove that black vacuum control box as well off the passenger side firewall. That'll give you much more room when it's time to remove that EGR pipe. Here you can see me struggling to get it off, but eventually I get it. and mine was super plugged up. This is a big cause for blowing head gaskets on the Acura Legend. With that EGR pipe removed and the EGR valves removed, you can then take off your intake manifold. Then I start removing the covers, the outer timing covers, valve covers, and the manifold heat shields. The driver's side heat shield is easiest to pull out the top, and the passenger side heat shield is easiest to drop through the bottom. Then I remove the heat shield off the Y pipe. There's 6 nuts you got to remove to take the Y pipe off the manifolds. These are a little tricky to get at, so this is where the extensions and the swivels are going to help you out. Here you see I'm marking the timing belt in the cam gears before I loosen up the tensioner and slide the belt off. What I do is I take those marks on my belt and I transfer them to the new belt, which just makes things easier when you're throwing it on and aligning everything. You're going to want to use an impact to remove the bolts holding on the cam gears. That'll keep them from spinning. And once you get the cam gears off, you can remove the rear timing covers and the camshaft angle sensor from the driver's side head. So you want to make sure you get everything disconnected from the head. Here you can see I'm cracking loose the head bolts. You want to do that in sequence before removing them. But yeah, you want to double check that you get all the electrical connectors disconnected, especially like the oxygen sensors. You want to get the knock sensors disconnected because they break really easy. You want to get those out of there, and the little harness that runs through that valley. The dipstick tube also has a bolt that attaches to the driver's side head. That'll hold you up. And make sure you got some help prying it out. Do not pry on the mating surfaces. Here you can see where my head gasket was seeping. I got a little carbon staining on the fire ring and a piece of composite missing between the combustion chamber and the coolant jacket. With the heads off, we can now disconnect the rest of the engine harness, and now we got a little bit more room to take off the accessory belts, and we're going to get that crank pulley off soon, so having the belts off is going to help, and we want to get that radiator out of the way. You got to make sure you disconnect those automatic transmission fluid lines and have a bucket ready to catch some of the fluid and be ready to top it off when you get everything back together. Now, removing the crank pulley bolt is one of the hardest things to do on these Hondas and Acuras. I ended up using a 3/4 inch pneumatic impact fed by a 3/4 inch line, eventually got it off. But as you see, the crank pulley doesn't slide all the way off until you remove that little subframe brace in front of the pulley. So that comes out pretty easy. Getting it back in is more of a challenge, but once you get it out of there, then you can slide the crank pulley right off. Boop. Before sending the heads out for resurfacing, I gotta completely dismantle them and get them as clean as I can. Now, not only did I get them resurfaced, but I also got a 3-angle valve job on them, so the valve seats are nice and fresh. I got the rocker arm O-rings replaced, the valve seals replaced, and the cam seals replaced. On the block side, I stuff all the orifices with shop towels before scraping the surface clean with a carbide scraper. And you gotta be really careful doing this. This gets most of the gasket material off. If you still have a little bit of staining, I use a 220 grit emery cloth to make it look brand new. My heater control valve was looking a little crusty, so I replaced that too. While you're in there, it's not a bad idea to replace the thermostat and all the seals on the thermostat housing. Here I got the heads back and they're looking brand new. Time to reassemble them. So when it came time to install the heads, I definitely struggled a little bit. I recommend you really zip tie everything out of the way, giving yourself as much clearance as possible. And they're pretty heavy, so kind of holding them over the fenders is a little bit of a struggle when your arms are completely stretched. I got the heads installed, but I wasn't happy because I ended up bending the head gaskets. So I took them back off and I gave it another shot. I had to get some new head gaskets, but I found that the best way to install those heads is, like I said, get everything zipped out of the way and just crawl up in that engine bay and lower the heads straight down. Then, of course, you're going to want to torque them in sequence. With the heads on, I began dismantling and assembling the new timing components. I also replaced the water pump. I found a YouTube video online for all the timing belt needs, and it was super helpful, so I'll go ahead and link that in the description. I'd say currently we're at the halfway point of this project, so now it's basically just reinstalling everything just as you took it off. This is where it's really nice to have those pictures. You'll be referencing them a lot as you put everything back together. Luckily for me, everything went pretty dang smooth. Now, since everything from the block up got super cleaned and re-gasketed, I would consider this a top-end rebuild, especially since we went through with the new valve seals, the valve job, and everything. You're going to want to grab a buddy and the Honda crank pulley holder tool to torque down that crank bolt. I also struggled a little bit putting that front subframe connector on, but I found it's a lot easier if you step on it. Then finally the bolt holes line up and you get those bolts back in. Here's where I made that custom heat shield for my Y-pipe. They only put the heat shield on one side, and I had to cut a couple tabs off the Y-pipe to make it fit, but it definitely helped giving me a little extra clearance. Now, I accidentally stripped out one of these Y-pipe nuts, but that was all right. I was able to fix the issue using a 3/8 by 16 National Course rethreading die, and it worked just fine. So after 54 hours of labor, it's finally time to start this thing up. Fingers crossed I didn't forget anything. Who knows if it's gonna run right away, because I still gotta bleed the coolant, get all the air out of the system. But yeah, since I'll keep it up on the ramps, check for leaks, and yeah, we're gonna see how it goes. I'm extremely nervous. It's got a check engine light, so I must have forgot to plug in something. No. So my check engine light was for my intake air temperature sensor. This was my mistake here. I left it in the intake manifold when I cleaned it out, and those sensors really don't like carbon choke cleaner or any harsh cleaning chemicals. They're plastic and it damages them really easily. So I swapped it out and got ready for a second start. It's alive! Finally. That was my
Well, you gotta feel good about that.
Yeah. It sounds like it might be missing though. Take a little bit, but it's still good. Well, that was sounding pretty rough on that second start. I was extremely nervous, extremely worried. When you do a top-end rebuild like this, there's 1,000 things you change, 1,000 things that could go wrong. Luckily, everything was fine. But yeah, now we have no check engine light. Walking around to the front of the car. We got most of the bubbles out of the cooling system. I'm sure what was going on right away was the air was going through the idle air control valve, making the idle fluctuate. And then on top of that, this car has hydraulic lifters. So they were probably dry, not filled with oil. So probably took a while for those to fill up. And now there's no lifter tick. There's no exhaust leaks. This thing is smooth and quiet. So I think I'm done bleeding the coolant. Right now the idle is sitting super steady, as well as the coolant temperature gauge. I've got good heat in the car. I'm gonna back it off the ramp shortly. I left it overnight and made sure we don't have any leaks. Everything looks good. I reattached the plastic under tray. Once I get it off the ramps and level, I'm going to check the transmission fluid with the dipstick there, and I'll probably have to add a little bit. Since you remove the radiator, 2 of the transmission fluid lines have to be disconnected, and that tends to drip a little bit. So yeah, we'll top that off, and then I'll go get a car wash today. We'll see how it drives. So I drove it like 50 feet and the D4 light started blinking. I pulled the code and it was a code 4 for the vehicle speed sensor. So I had it plugged in, but I did not have it plugged in all the way. So we'll get that one pushed in. We'll go for another drive. Yeah. So on my second test drive, the car was shaking at idle and it seemed down on power. I tested coil packs, spark plugs, and it actually came down to a stuck injector. I took the injector on the bench and I was able to free it up, but just to be safe in the future, I will be getting 6 new OEM injectors. With that injector freed up though, the engine ran way smoother than before and the idle increased by about 200 RPMs. We were finally ready to drive this thing home. Well, after a ton of troubleshooting, we are back on the road, riding smooth, and finally riding on all 6 cylinders. So yeah. Feels really good. Watch me put the gap on this GR Corolla. See ya. Oh yeah. Yeah, she's doing just fine. Well, we made it back home from the shop. This thing is running good and it is pulling hard. This thing feels amazing. So all said and done, after all the troubleshooting, that was like 60 hours of labor. But we brought this Legend back to life. So once again, I hope this video helps you out, kind of gives you an idea of what you're up against here. While I was under the car, I noticed that I do have a slight rear main seal leak, so I think I'm gonna be tackling that, making a video about that as well. And then I also have a keyless entry system and a remote start that I'll be installing on this Legend here, so I'll be filming that. And yeah, we'll see if I have any other content I can make on this car. I really like these vehicles, and it's really up to us to keep them on the road. Thank you guys for watching. Bye-bye.